Heather, Penny, welcome to Succession Stories. I'm so glad we were introduced by our mutual friend, Chris, out in the
Yes, me
West
too.
Coast.
Yes. Thank you,
Our dear
Chris. And
friend.
yes, good to be here with you, Laurie.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. This is going to be an interesting one. As you told me off air, you've been listening to the show, and it's a very
Hmm.
technical show. Sometimes we talk about
Hmm.
numbers, we talk about all kinds of things when it comes to a
Yeah.
transaction and the transition of a business around the transactional side. Yes,
Hmm.
absolutely, you're right. But we also do focus on the emotional side of
Hmm.
transition, which is
Hmm.
why you're here, why I've invited you
Yes.
on.
Yes.
And I'm excited to talk with you about your perspective as we talk about
Hmm.
transition from the personal side.
Hmm.
And there's a
Yep.
big intersection, right? You
Yep.
asked me off air, hey, is this going to be personal or business? And I said, yes.
And I loved your answer because it makes me more nervous when people are trying to separate it and act like a cultural or corporate transition isn't going to affect you personally or any emotional level. That always makes me more alarmed because they are so intertwined in it. We have to stay integrated in them.
Yeah. And what I liked about your story, and if you want to just tee it up a little bit, how
Sure.
you transitioned in your career, you
Hmm.
started out um, in university setting
Hmm.
and also in elementary. And,
Yeah.
there's
Teaching.
there's a range of teaching that you did,
Yeah.
and you found your way to what you're doing today. So I want to fast forward a bit, but just,
Yeah.
keep us with you. I think your transition and how you empathize
Yeah.
is part of the narrative.
Sure. I can give you that in a nutshell. I'm in my 50s now, and I started out my career teaching little third graders. So getting my teaching credential and moving into education, and then quickly moved up into getting my master's in leadership and moved into administration and moved into teaching at a fairly young age in my late 20s, moving into teaching university level, where sometimes the students were older than I was. I was teaching adult learners. So it was a really awesome trajectory where I got to experience the essence of human growth and development and learning. But more importantly, as we talk about transitions, man, it just makes me grin because we had transitions with a third grader going to fourth grade or an adult learner who was maybe a 55-year-old guy returning back to get his teaching credential or to finish his bachelor's degree and undergrad work. I had everything. And so I really got not only to take the journey with people in their transitions, but I developed a tremendous amount of compassion and empathy, but also a commitment to get people to where they want to go. I didn't want to err on, almost like a therapeutic feel of, oh, poor you. You're having a hard time with 3 times 3. Well, don't worry. You don't need to get your multiplication tables down. Fourth grade doesn't need it. That's not how you could think as an educator, but you carried me all the way up into my adult years. And it was around in my teaching at the university level, I started doing some consulting and working with people. And I realized I just love the essence of how humanity is talking about change and growth and transition. And my background as an educator really got me ready for that. So that's why I'm looking at my career level. On the internal side, here's me going, who am I? I've got 2 kids in grade school, and I think I don't want to do what I used to do anymore. And my next level is to really get tenure as a university professor, but that just doesn't appeal to me. Well, maybe I'll go work as a nonprofit and start working in some of these fields that I've loved consulting in. None of that appealed to me. So I was in that identity crisis, or what I also like to call my identity kind of opportunity time, where I started realizing I don't quite know what I want to do, but I know what I don't want to do. That became such a profound time for me where I ended up just accidentally hiring a coach. And it was during that time that the coach said to me, you know what, you've been interviewing, you haven't been really satisfied. Have you thought about coaching? And I thought, well, now I am." That appeals to me. What I was nervous about as we talk about transitions, there's things that hold us back that we have to overcome. I was nervous about the finance side, the business side. I was super competent in the teaching side, the education side, and creating curriculum and doing that, but I was nervous about running my own business. That was the only thing holding me back. And I say only now because I'm on the other side of running my own company for the last 15 years and I've figured that out. But then that was scary for me coming out of teaching. So that was the huge thing I had to overcome of saying, I do want to own my own company and I want to be a successful coach consultant, Therefore, I've got to figure out the entrepreneur piece. And that was a whole nother ball game for me. Ended up going back and getting my PhD, and it really was to study transition, what helps us grow emotional well-being and our career fulfillment, because I wanted to start working with people like me who was kind of in that midlife opportunity going, I know what I don't want to do, but I don't know what I do want to do. And that's then where I developed this whole coaching aspect and had such a learning experience as I coached along with my clientele, but also had to come through it myself of saying, here's who I am now, and get my own clarity, my own confidence and courage. And so those are the three things that I talk a lot about, how we cultivate those three things so that we can not just push through a transition, but we can really move from a survival mentality to a thriving mentality.
I love that. Yeah. And you've written two books, and both books, I think, interrelate very well to this topic. The first one, The Life That You're Made For.
Yeah.
And thank you for sharing your books with me. I enjoyed reading them. The second one, the new book, is called Grace Space. When we apply this conversation to the audience, who I believe is listening,
Mm-hmm.
for our audience out there of founders,
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneurs, acquisition entrepreneurs, multi-generational companies, we've
Mm-hmm.
seen a lot of people struggle with the idea of an identity transition related
Mm-hmm.
to their business. And we can be empathetic with that, right?
Right.
If roughly two out of five or three out of five companies have their name on the door as a family company, there's clearly an identity there. But again, as a founder, so many
Mm-hmm.
business owners say it's my baby, right? They've created
Mm-hmm.
something, they're proud of it. Letting go becomes an emotional tug
Mm-hmm.
for them. And there's
Mm-hmm.
a financial side to that as well as an emotional side. I want to talk with you about this idea of creating an identity runway where it
Mm-hmm.
isn't a cliff, but
Mm-hmm.
we've got to give ourselves the grace space to
Mm-hmm.
do the what if thinking.
Yes.
How should we approach that?
Well, the first book I wrote really approaches it because it's pretty beefy, 18 chapters, and it's a big, nice, fat read, but it's meant to sit down and slow down. What we start feeling that pressure, especially for those of us who are high achievers, is I got to figure this out. I got to figure this out. I got to figure this out. And so our anxiety and our intensity just continues to grow as we put that pressure on yourself. And to reference what you just said, we have to give grace to ourselves to let ourselves stay curious and learn and push through learning curves. What we Many of us don't know how to do that. So in this larger book of The Life You're Made For, it basically is saying, chapter 1, restorative rest. And I literally say, here's your permission slip to slow down. I didn't realize I had to say that to people, but it was because I had to learn how to say it to myself. As a high achiever and pushing through in academia and all this stuff, I'm like, I'll just take another class. I'll just get another degree. I'll just do this, 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 this. It wasn't getting fixed because my identity was longing for something more, which was saying, Heather, could you just slow down long enough to stay curious about how you've changed and grown and what you've learned of just being a mother and how you no longer want to do what you used to do? If you can slow down long enough, I promise you, this is Heather speaking to Heather, I promise you, Heather, you'll be able to get the clarity you need for what's next. Many of us don't quite know how to do that. And so what we tend to do is what has worked for us in the past. Just do more, hustle more. And I want to be careful how I say that because there is success with that. We have to light a fire. We have to do action steps. We have to move forward. But if that's the only thing we're doing and we're not learning how to counterbalance it with, maybe I need to take a retreat. Maybe I need to take some time off. Maybe I need to just pull back a little bit and have a planning day for myself or for my team or take a vacation just to clear my head. These are all things that we don't quite reach for, and it's really not our North American culture telling us what to reach for. We're really told to reach for do more, think more, plan more, dream more, be more, hustle more, just do more. And we don't realize how much that's hurting that beautiful rampway that you talked about for our identity.
There's some challenging statistics out there. About a year after the sale, people are asked about their satisfaction and their happiness. And 75%, three out of four people, 1 year after the sale, express some level of regret. When I
Really?
talk about regret, I tend to put it in two camps first, because I think there are decisions we make that we regret, or there's decisions we don't make, right? And we regret not having that taking action on it. I think it was really interesting to tie this back to you and your husband. I was listening to one of your podcast episodes, and your podcast is the same name as your book. So if people want to give it a listen, I would
Yep.
definitely recommend The Life You're Made For podcast. And you had your husband on the show, and you both asked each other about your word of the year.
Oh, yes,
And there's
yes.
this very interesting yin and yang with you and your husband and the words you selected. And as I was reflecting on what I just shared with you about regret, I think it actually fits very well with that framework. So why don't we talk a little bit about that, about the action versus inaction, and
Yes.
how that ties in of how we might approach as we look ahead to our future transitions and anticipating those transitions.
Oh, yes. Okay, just for a little context for our audience, his word was praxis, which means to stay in action. It's a kind of complicated word, but it just means to stay in action. My word was patience. So we kind of got our clarity toward the end of the conversation. We were kind of laughing, going, that so fits our personality. And so I think as you talk about holding that balance, the first thing is really understanding yourself. What kind of word did I need for the year? I really needed patience because I'm such a strong activist and achiever. And that's kind of my drug of choice, right? Achieve and do. Once you know that about yourself, you give yourself the grace to say, hey, you got to reach for something that is just going to help stabilize you and balance you. For my husband, he's very organic and beautiful. He can still get things done, but he can tend to avoid longer. And so clearly that's caused a little bit of tension sometimes in our relationship, but it's also been a place where we've been able to understand each other and give each other the grace to how we're going to move forward. And you talk about transitions, going back to that, how we step into those transitions, help you understand what is it that you need to move forward and what is it you need in order to pace yourself in the way that is sustainable.
One of the words that you use to describe your practice and what's motivating you and sort of a core pillar is courage. And it strikes me the opposite of the courage is the fear, right? But they certainly go together. And for people to make that determination to sell their business, to pass it to the next generation, to make these big decisions, to get clarity on what those decisions are, to take confidence, those other words that you use. I love those words. So clarity, confidence, and courage. But let's hone in on this third one,
Yeah.
because it's the fear that holds us back sometimes.
Yes.
Is it the fear of things we don't control when it comes
Yes.
to a business transition and our personal transition? How
Yes.
do you think about that?
Yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, because oftentimes we don't even know what we're fearful of. It, I'll explain it probably in a conversation I had with a CEO a couple of years ago, and it's always stayed with me. And I think I even used it in my book, but we had been working together, a very competent, high level leader. And we've been working together for several months. And finally, I stopped and I said, you have all the clarity you need, which is about knowing what's true and what's in front of you. You have all the confidence you need, which is about understanding what you're believing. What you're not having is courage. You're not engaging your courage, which requires setting an action step, taking one step after another, not trying to get to the very end goal. So sometimes we'd like to talk about the antithesis of courage is fear. And I want to say, yes, but I think what also stops us is the confusion and the complexity of why we're pausing. And that's why we hire coaches and consultants, honestly, because I come alongside people and I say, yeah, you're actually smart enough and strong enough and tough enough that if you knew what it was, you would overcome it. I think what's stopping you is not just the fear. What's stopping you is the confusion of understanding why this feels so complex. So let's unpack that. And when we went there, what he began to realize is I don't want to move forward because I have outgrown this position and I actually want to find an exit from this company. Isn't that powerful? And so my job talking about transition wasn't trying to get him to move forward in his position, but my job now as a coach was to help him understand it is time for me to exit. I'm not avoiding my courage and engaging my fear, because that's not what's stopping me. What's stopping me is that I don't want to be here anymore. I want to try something else with my life. Once we then shifted there, his courage was engaged not in the area of the company and staying in that space, but his courage was engaged in, how do I get to explore what I'm really wanting to do? And now, how do I leave well? And how do I create a succession plan? So now his courage was engaged in the right area. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that example.
Mm-hmm.
Makes me think about some of the work that I do with clients because, as I mentioned in the beginning, it isn't just about the transaction, it's about the
Yeah.
preparation and kind of getting our emotional headset
Yeah.
towards transition and feeling good about it. The more we feel
Mm-hmm.
good about it, the more we will actively participate in it. And the more we actively participate in it, we'll have a more transition ready business, which
Exactly.
should and have other positive attributes to that, financial and otherwise. So, how do we think about this transition readiness when it comes to ourselves? One of the
Yeah.
things that you might have some experience with your clients is
Mm,
visioning. And I wanted to get your
mm,
thoughts on how do we develop a vision for ourselves beyond today when it comes to seeing
mm.
ourselves in a different capacity outside of being a business owner?
Wow. How do we develop our vision for ourselves and kind of what's next?
Right.
I think, again, that requires pulling back and taking time. I think we underestimate that. In fact, there's another great example. I just was talking to my COO, for lack of a better word, assistant. She runs everything. And I said, "Well, I don't think this is a conversation we can have in an hour. I think we might need a planning day. What do you think?" And she goes, "Definitely." So even just understanding that's a whole nother category. We're trying to have this amazing visions for our lives in a 1 hour meeting. And I go, no, when we want to transition well, we want to make it sustainable, and we want to increase our quality of life and who we want to be and the purpose that we want to serve in this world. I'm sorry, but you can't squish it in a 15-minute agenda item. You can't squish it into a 1 hour meeting. If it's big, you got to give it the big space. And the bigger it is, the more space you got to give it. So when we're thinking about maybe transitioning in your life and in your world, this is what I learned personally. And it's also where I walk along with clients. Typically, you want to make a big life change. You got to give yourself the permission to start asking the right questions. A lot of times we ask shame-based questions. What's wrong with me? Why can't I figure it out? Why doesn't this make me happy? None of those are helpful questions. And one of the chapters in my books is good question asking. So learn how to say what's right with me. What have I liked about the last 2 decades of my career? This is what I asked of myself. And I looked backwards and I said, I loved teaching. I just got tired of teaching the 3 R's. I got tired of teaching other people's curriculum. I got tired of fitting into other people's agenda. But the reality, my clarity was I love teaching. So who I am as a coach is very much teacher oriented, which is how do I get people from A to B? How do I understand where it is they want to go and help support the journey and getting them there? So it's all about teaching and growth. Then how do I get to write my own curriculum? My own curriculum is my books, the 3 C's. All of that I got to start doing based on asking a better question. What is it that I did love? Out of all the stuff that was happening to me over the last 2 decades of my life, what is it that I loved about what I was doing? I got to take that out. And then I would say, what's right with me? This is the number one question I help clients shift. What's right with me? Once we start asking those good questions, man, the vision starts unfolding. And going back to what you first said at the beginning of this conversation, I love it. Having grace towards yourself. Having grace towards yourself means staying curious. And when we are asking and staying curious with other people around us, we're asking them good questions. We're not coming up to them and going, "What's wrong with you that you don't like this job? What's wrong with you that you can't figure out your future?" But we do that to ourselves, right? We're the hardest on ourselves. So learning how to talk to ourselves, how we would like to talk about a team that you want to help them envision for the next 5 months or for the next 5 years or for the next 2 weeks. Learning how to take ourselves through that is really an important process. And that's why I wrote the longer book, The Life You're Made For, because I help you slow down and say, for 6 chapters, you're going to read about clarity. 6 chapters, you're going to read about confidence. 6 chapters, you're going to read about courage. That in itself begins the process of learning how to give yourself that permission that you need to realize I have what I need inside to get the vision that I need for my life. I just don't give myself the permission to do it. And then meanwhile, it's like I'm just nipping at myself the whole time saying, you got to get it together. You got to hit another standard. You got to stay on that hamster wheel.
The overachievers are now wondering, oh, how long is it going to take me to do all that?
Totally. Totally.
And the answer always is, well, it depends. But I
uh,
think the bottom line is we need to make space for that thought process. It's why I've written the book that I've written about the
mm,
business transition handbook and the course that I'm creating, because I really am
mhm.
encouraging business owners to make the time for these types of thoughts. They are
Yeah.
separate from your day to day, and it can be hard. Look,
Yeah.
I've gone through lots of transitions too, and I want
Hmm.
my audience to understand that I empathize with them. And that's why I'm bringing people like you on to the show, Heather. And I really appreciate all of your perspective. If you're going to, if you're going to kind of drop the mic and say, hey, here's two or
Hmm.
three things that are really stand
Yeah.
out, to encapsulate this conversation, what do you want to share?
I think I want to leave, we all love these big ideas, but I think our hunger is often like, well, what do I do now? I think I want to leave your listeners with this idea that start with what I call a thrive plan. I want to get really practical for you. This is my teacher side. Start with what I call a thrive plan and set aside at least an hour. Think about these 4 areas: daily, weekly, monthly, annually. Set aside like an hour a day to start really dreaming about who you are, what you want. Start looking at a monthly time, excuse me, a weekly time, which was like 2 to 4 hours a week. Start looking at a monthly time, which is maybe like a half day or full day. And then this last one is the most important. If you really want to change the course of your life and envision it and do something that's sustainable for you and step into the life that you feel like you're made for, take that, what I call a me retreat. 2 to 3 days is usually what I do. That is life changing for me. And let me just be really clear. Just this, I'm speaking to all my overachievers here. Do not bring all your agendas and your work and to-do lists. Literally go and unplug and do anything that is not productive. It's going to feel counterintuitive, but you will come back refreshed, ready then to start plan and start putting pen to paper. Your brain, your heart, your mind, everything needs a break. And when you give yourself that break on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis, you'll start seeing your clarity increase, which then starts motivating that confidence and that courage.
I love that. And we can just give an idea for a budget range. Here's something that costs nothing. Go to your
Yes.
library and
Yes.
choose some books and hang out there for a few days and read them.
Yeah.
That will
Exactly.
cost you exactly nothing.
Yes.
And then on
Yes.
the other end, go find an amazing
Yeah.
spa somewhere across the
Yep.
country or somewhere else and dive into that retreat. So there's lots of
Yep.
ways to do this, and especially if you don't have the budget, but you have to budget the time. I guess that's the biggest
The
message.
time. Yeah. And I've had both ends of the spectrum where I've had many resources and I'm like scrapping it together. One of my friends is always like, you got to get scrappy, Heather. And that's what I would say to the audience. Like, you got to get scrappy. Put yourself first. Don't let money be the thing that stops you or lack of resources. And to your point, make the time. You deserve it.
Yeah, you deserve it for sure. Heather, there probably are many things that inspire you, but I'd love to
Mhm.
hear if there are any quotes that you would share about entrepreneurship or just anything else that you love.
I think one of my favorites that I've lived by quite a bit is by Parker Palmer. And he's written many books. He's a great philosopher of our time and he's aging. And I just feel so lucky that I got to live during his time period. But one of the quotes he says, and I used it in one of my books quite a bit, was we need spaces within us and spaces between us that welcomes the wisdom of the soul. I read that in my 20s and now in my 50s. I'm telling you, that has just stuck with me, probably because I needed it. And I think what it does, it honors the fact that you are holding your inner wisdom. We just don't really believe it or trust it, and we don't give ourselves the space to listen to it. So we need spaces within us and between us, like talking to other people and what we're doing, that welcomes the wisdom of the soul that we hold within us.
I love that. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Hmm.
Heather, if people want to learn more about you, about your practice, your books, and your show, what's a way to find you?
The easiest way to find me is everything is housed on my website, heatherpinney.com. And it'll take you to where to buy my books. It's all on Amazon, where my podcasts are. Of course, I'm on Apple, Spotify, all that good stuff. But you can start with heatherpinney.com, and I have a lot of great resources there too that you can access.
Thank you. Well, thanks for coming on the show, sharing your insights and your experience. And I think this was a great conversation.
Oh, it was great. Thanks so much for having me, Laurie.
And so to our listeners, thank you for coming to Succession Stories each week. Be sure to subscribe and follow the show in your favorite podcast player. And of course, follow the Business Transition Sherpa on YouTube for the entire catalog. And be sure to go to successionstories.com if you want to sign up for our newsletter. Tune in next time for more insights from transition to transaction.